Bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio de Buscando Certeza. Mi nombre es Gonzalo Perilou y en el episodio de hoy vamos a estar hablando del budismo Newar, que es el budismo que se desarrolló en Nepal. Este budismo, como todos los budismos que se desarrollan en un país en particular, en un continente en particular, tiene características diferentes a otros. Una de las características principales del budismo Newar es que se practica en sánscrito, a diferencia del budismo tántrico que se desarrolló en Tíbet. El budismo Newari adopta las prácticas tántricas y se desarrollan hoy por hoy, ya que es una tradición viva, en sánscrito. A diferencia del budismo tibetano que, como todos saben, se practica en tibetano. Y nadie mejor para hablar sobre este tema que el Padre Greg, como lo conocemos en Nepal. Y Greg Sharkey es un sacerdote jesuita y antropólogo que enseña en el Instituto de Estudios Budistas de la Universidad de Katmandú, que es Ranjung Yeshe. Allí es donde lo conocí, tomando una clase de antropología en donde estábamos estudiando hinduismo, el pasado del budismo, cómo se desarrolló el budismo y distintos aspectos antropológicos y etnográficos de los lugares en donde se desarrolló el budismo. Y en particular esa clase también incluía un módulo sobre budismo Newari, que es sumamente interesante, como van a ver en la entrevista a continuación, en donde hablamos sobre el tema. El padre Greg nació en Pittsburgh, Pensilvania, en Estados Unidos, y ingresó a la orden jesuita en el año 78 y fue ordenado en el año 88. Y pasó gran parte de su vida adulta viviendo en Nepal. Desde hace muchísimo tiempo él vive en Nepal, en donde es director del Centro de Investigación Jesuita de Katmandú y profesor adjunto de religión también de la Universidad de Santa Clara de Estados Unidos. Además de los títulos de posgrado en teología y filosofía, el padre Greg también realizó una maestría en estudios sánscritos e indios y tiene un doctorado en budismo de la Universidad de Oxford. Así que no solamente es un sacerdote cristiano, sino que tiene muchos conocimientos sobre budismo. Desde el año 2013 es asesor superior también general de los jesuitas para las relaciones con el budismo y es funcionario de la Secretaría para el Ecumenismo y Diálogo en Roma. Su especialidad, como vamos a ver en el episodio a continuación, es el budismo Newar, que es uno de los temas que enseña en el Instituto Ranjung Yeshe, y ahí es donde aprendí más sobre este tipo de budismo en particular, junto también con otros cursos que da sobre hinduismo y antropología y etnografía religiosa. Así que es sumamente interesante para mí ver cómo puede armonizar todas estas tradiciones y practicar su camino cristiano. Conocí al padre Greg, como les comentaba, cuando estaba tomando este curso, y es uno de los pocos occidentales que aprendió el idioma Newari. Cuando íbamos a hacer algunos estudios de campo, como por ejemplo en algunos monasterios Newari, él podía hablar Newari con los locales y todos estaban realmente sorprendidos, ya que no hay muchos occidentales que hablen este idioma, ya que tiene ciertas características que lo hacen difícil de aprender, ya que este idioma se habla solamente en ciertas regiones de Nepal, ni siquiera todos los nepalíes conocen el idioma Newari. Así que sin más los dejo con la entrevista con el padre Greg. Quedaron muchos temas sobre los cuales me hubiese gustado hablar. No fue suficiente el tiempo que tuvimos en esta entrevista, así que seguramente vamos a hacer una segunda parte. Y por otro lado, la entrevista la subtitulé ya que está en inglés. Tengan en cuenta que para aquellos que se están comenzando en el budismo o incluso practicantes experimentados en el budismo tibetano, vamos a estar hablando de ciertos términos y características que surgen en la discusión que no son comúnmente conocidas entre los budistas, así que seguramente les va a dar mucho material para googlear e investigar más tarde. Así que sin más, los dejo con la entrevista, espero que la disfruten. Thank you so much, Father Greg, for joining the podcast today. Your anthropology class have enriched a lot the way that I understand Buddhism, especially in the Katmandú Valley. So I'm sure the listeners will find a lot of value in what you have to share. So I know that the conversation will be mainly about Newar Buddhism, but I wanted to ask you before that, how did you decide to study, to become a priest, specifically a Jesuit priest?
Okay, sure. Well, in a sense, they're tied. These things end up being tied together, obviously. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, but I went to university college at Dartmouth College up in New England. And up throughout my high school years, I had gotten very turned off on Christianity, on Catholicism, and didn't sort of considered myself as a former Catholic. And then at Dartmouth, I had experiences that ultimately not only led me back into the church, but I then encountered Jesuits, and I was very intrigued by their philosophy. They didn't say we are teachers, we work in hospitals. They said we go wherever the need is greatest, and that attracted me. So I had been throughout my high school years and early college. I'd been practicing transcendental meditation, which in those days, 40, 50 years ago, was extremely popular. Pardon me. And so I'd learned already a bit about Hinduism indirectly that way. And on the side, interestingly, my Jesuit spiritual director, or spiritual father, as they say in some places, gave me books by Chogyam Trungpa. He said, "Oh, here's a really good spirituality book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, or The Myth of Freedom." And so that kind of led me into an interest in Buddhism. I had studied religion as an undergrad, but I was looking at Egypt and the ancient Near East. So anyway, when I was a novice, my first year in the Jesuits, after the 30-day retreat, we were all sent off to the third world. Now, most people were just sent to someplace nearby, like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Jamaica. Okay, but two of the novices were always sent to India, and I was one of the ones who went that year. It was the last time, in fact, we were allowed to do it. So I was intrigued by all of it. But particularly after spending 5 months in India, Nepal looked like heaven. And that was it was a very different Nepal too. It was a much more simple and primitive place than it is now, beautifully so. And so, anyways, but the Jesuits who were here, especially the ones who just founded a research center, said, "Why don't you consider coming back for regency?" All right. Now, regency, or magisterium, as it's called in some places, is before you're a priest, you're already a Jesuit, not yet a priest, and basically you work as a teacher. And the So you're a regent master
Mhm.
of students. So I did my regency in Nepal, and I taught at St. Xavier's, which gave me connections that are still useful. I was just with the dean of Katmandú University, who was my former student. Okay, and we were having a meeting about RYI. So, but the I was also, we had a very enlightened superior, and he allowed me, kind of against Jesuit norms, to go live in villages in order to learn Nepali, and then later to learn Newar. A lot of the other older Jesuits thought this was really improper, especially because I wasn't a priest yet. But he saw the need. He said, if you're going to work here long term, you absolutely must learn the language. And I'd already learned through experience that a lot of Americans who'd given their whole lives, they came out to India. In one case, the guy came in 1929, and this was 1979, 50 years later, right? And he still couldn't speak Nepali, nor could he speak Hindi, where he'd lived for 30 years.
Mhm.
So he'd speak this mishmash of English, Nepali, Hindi, and the workers would just sit there looking at him. And then as soon as he left the room, they'd say, "We keep on by," like, what did he say? And then we'd have to translate and say, "I think he's trying to tell you this." Yeah.
Mhm.
So obviously, you're not going to be effective if you don't know the language well. You're not going to be as effective. Of course, they were running English medium schools, so that's all. They didn't need anything. They didn't need much beyond English. I was already knew that I'd be doing anthropological research, ethnographic research, so I really wanted to learn the language well. So I was very fortunate. I lived with a Brahmin family who were very demanding to live with, but who were really good at teaching me the language. So that was a great help. During that time, I taught in St. Xavier's School for 2 years, with language study before and after it, where I was free and I didn't have to be in the school. But during that time in the school, every day after classes were over and after sports and club activities were finished, I would walk down to the town of Patan, where you've been, and which is the most Buddhist of all the Newar towns here in the valley. And I made dozens and dozens of friends. They're still good friends to this day, many of them. And I would then, they would say, "Oh, there's a festival coming up, on the full moon, next full moon. Tomorrow is this festival. Please come back at such and such a time, or on this holiday, this is what happens." And so I was able to absorb quite a bit just even before I finished teaching, and long before I went to graduate school. So then I returned to the U.S. did my theology studies, became a priest. And in those days, Jesuits had a special permission. We could be ordained after 3 years, even though we had to still do 4 years of theology. So I did a Master of Divinity in one place in Boston, and then I went to Berkeley to do the licentiate in theology. And then after that, I came back to Nepal briefly to get my languages back up because I hadn't used them for 4 years, or not, I hadn't been in the Nepali speaking environment or Newar speaking. So then I spent about 4 months here teaching English to young Jesuits, and then from India. And then I went to Oxford to do my MPhil in Sanskrit and then a doctorate in Buddhism after that.
We have always this tension in Buddhism between the scholars and the practitioners. Do you have that healthy tension as well in the Jesuit order, given that you
Absolutely,
study for
absolutely.
so
In
many
fact,
years?
to be honest, the people who started using scholar practitioner are people like John McCransky, who actually taught at a Catholic university, as you know, for his whole career at Boston College. It can be phrased in different ways, but the idea that you combine praxis with your study, okay, is a very deep part, not just of Jesuit tradition, but really of particularly in religious orders. Let's say theologically, you can't. It's not just a question of sitting down and thinking about ideas or looking at the Bible and dreaming up theology, but it has to grow out of the life of the church, you know. So, and that means also growing out of the life of the individual theologian or priest. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yes, the models we're very comfortable with.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So Chokinima Rinpoche, as you know, he has been emphasizing this thing of becoming a scholar practitioner. And in your own experience, how much the studies have enriched your spiritual
Oh
development,
yeah,
your theology
absolutely.
studies?
Very, very important. I mentioned that when I was in college, in university, I had done ancient Near East, which meant basically Bible courses, although we also did Egyptology, and we had to learn what Akkadian as much as we could, as much was available. So anyway, so when I entered theology, I already had more scripture courses than were required for a Catholic priest in training. So I still took more because we had some of the finest. My theology school called Weston was in a how do you call it, like a group of other theologates with Harvard Divinity School and Episcopal Divinity School, and then several others. They called it the Boston Theological Institute. So anyway, we had some brilliant Jesuits. I mean, really amazing, famous biblical scholars, and so I was happy to take more courses. But church history, I was really into. In fact, my Jesuit superiors wanted me to do a doctorate in church history, so that I could be a professor in a theology school. And I avoided that with all my strength because I already knew that I wanted to do Oriental studies, something on Asia. But and that was invaluable because the more you know of history accurately, the freer you are. It's so much. When I look at like the situation, not just in the U.S., but you go onto social media and you see how ridiculous people can be. Like they imagine that they have a worldview that's kind of confined to this century and their life, their town. They don't have any of the breadth of vision. They say, "Oh, we're really in the worst possible times," and they say, "Really, the worst possible? What do you think it was like living through the Black Plague? Or what do you think it was like when the Visigoths stormed Rome and destroyed the city? I mean, say, guess what? Every generation has bad times. So anyway, but doing this theologically, like for example, nowadays people the conservative Catholics get very, very upset and very concerned about doing the ritual, the liturgy exactly, precisely the right way, because that's the way the church always did it. And you say, no, it isn't the way the church always did it. It's the way the church did it from about 1735 onward. You say, and before that, there were 10 different ways to say mass, and there were, so when you get the historical perspective, then you get some freedom. And then other courses are just obvious pastoral theology, learning how to, how to help people, basically. It was very important too. And I was okay at systematic theology. I generally did very well in theology. Like I said, they wanted me to stay in the field and go become a professor of it. So yeah, but so it was enjoyable and deeply enriching. Very, very. The other one good thing is that my professors also,
Yeah.
because I'd already been in Nepal and they knew of my long term interest, they were very generous in allowing me to take say the comparative theology angle on many issues whenever it was possible. So to do a comparison with Hindu or Buddhist thought, with Christian thought. So that kind of integrating of things was also good because what I was doing was reflecting on my time, my lived experience in Nepal, and combining it with my study, scholar practitioner.
Yeah. And I can imagine that there are not that many people doing what you have been doing at that time, and also especially with Newari Buddhism, being in contact with Newari Buddhism, because what you encounter if you just go to Buddha is like living in Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
It's just Tibetan Buddhism, and you
Yes.
miss the whole other aspect. Since I just mentioned Newari Buddhism, could you give an introduction of what Newari Buddhism is and the language for people who
Right,
don't
right.
know
Well,
anything about
Newar
it?
Buddhism is pardon me, it's the Buddhism practiced by the Newar people. The Newars are, in a general sense, an ethnic group, although, as you know from taking my class, I make a very careful distinction there. But the Newars are the indigenous people of Katmandú Valley. Eh? In fact, it's the word Neva, which is how Newars say their name, and Nepal, which is how they say the country name or the name of the valley, are the same word ultimately. Okay, there's very slight phonetic differences there, and this is because Nepal originally, up until the well, you could say up until the 18th century, Nepal only meant Katmandú Valley and the other areas just outside the valley that were under the control of the kings of Katmandú Valley, the Mullah dynasty. All right. Uh, the kingdom of Nepal was conquered, the Nepal Valley was conquered in 1769, as were many other small principalities across the Himalayas, and by the king of Gorkha. So the Gorkhali king then formed a new nation. Outsiders, the British always called it Nepal because Nepal was the most famous place. And of course, as he conquered each place, he became the king of that place. So Prithvi Narayan Shah was now the king of Nepal, as well as being the king of Gorkha and 35 other places. All right, but actually, legally speaking, it wasn't until 1920 that the name of the country went from Gorkha to Nepal. Yeah? Up until 1920, if you look at coin and stamp collections, it'll say Sri Gorkha Sarkar, the government of Nepal, or the king of Nepal. Sorry, King of Gorkha. Yeah. So, all right. So we're talking about the people who are indigenous to the valley, basically. Indigenous in the sense they're a composite people. People moved in from the north and south, and if they settled in this kingdom of Nepal and learned the language, adopted the culture, and the form of religion, well, then eventually they became Newars. They were accepted as locals. That's what ended in the 18th century. So now the interesting thing is that among the Newar people, for as far back as we can look into history, which is before the beginning of the Common Era, before the year zero, really, it looks as though Buddhism and Hinduism lived very peaceably side by side. Okay? And for that to happen within one community of people is somewhat rare, not completely rare. I mean, you might say something like, well, we had Jews living alongside Christians in Europe, and you say, yeah, and that wasn't always the best situation for the Jewish people. They also faced prejudice. That wasn't the case here. You could say there are Arab Christians alongside Arab Muslims, and you say, yeah, but the situation with the rise of Islam, Christians in the Arab world have always been persecuted to some extent. So, but we're not in the Newar case. We see a very peaceable coexistence, partly because the tradition about South Asian kingship, Hindu kingship, was that the king had to patronize all religion, all valid religions. So he had to patronize the Brahmins and the bhikshus, the monks, and in places where there was Jainism, then they would also support the Jain monks. So so there was always, even though Hinduism had a kind of preference the kings always identified themselves as Hindu. But in practice, I think that in the Katmandú Valley, a very high percentage of the people, if not the great majority, primarily practice Buddhism throughout most of the valley's history. Because when you look at the number of Brahmins, Newar Brahmins, as opposed to the number of Newar Buddhist priests, there's no comparison. It's like a 2%. You could meet all the Newar Brahmins in, say, Patan in an afternoon. Okay, so the other thing is they all will tell you about where they came from. And it's always like just 300 years ago or 400 years ago at most, which in this part of the world is like yesterday. So yeah, so they so you say the predominantly strongly hardcore Hindu Newars are almost all people who seem to have come in relatively recently and also were somehow connected with the ruling class of Nepal, after the Gorkha conquest. So, all right, now looking at the religion itself, what we have with the Newars is a variety of Mahayana, Vajrayana. Okay, the basic text of the Mahayana and the basic philosophy and the concepts are all identical to what you find in Tibet and in the rest of China, everywhere in the Mahayana world. It's also a place of Vajrayana practice, okay? And I kind of follow the theory that Mahayana is primarily the philosophy that provides the foundation, and Vajrayana is more of a practice, based on the tantras. So, but again, what the texts that are used, the primary texts that are used, the Mahayana sutras and the basic tantras, these are the same things that the Tibetans have. They're using the same text. Their rituals are ultimately almost identical. There are a lot of cultural things. So visually, it looks very, very different for a great number of reasons. But partly just because every time Buddhism went into a new country, unique local forms arose. When you can walk around the stupa here and you see almost every, you get hundreds of monks in red and yellow or maroon and yellow, marser. Then suddenly you'll see a couple of bhikshus in orange robes, or saffron robes. Theravada monks visiting, okay? Today there was a big crowd on the Kora of Chinese monks in long gray robes. Something that, if you didn't know anything about Buddhism and you put a bhikshu, a Tibetan lama, and a Chinese, monk next to each other, you would never guess that they followed the same religion, because Buddhism adapted to every culture that it went into. So in the same way, Tibet and Katmandú Valley are different places. And the other thing is that something that, as you know, made a huge impact on Buddhism in Nepal is that at some point in history, celibacy died out within the Sangha. We know that Buddhism flourished in India, that it grew and grew from the time of the Buddha, when Ashoka kind of gave it the seal of approval and backing, then Buddhism spread very rapidly. And we got to a point where much of South Asia was Buddhist or had a big Buddhist presence. Places you would never imagine today, like South India, Tamil Nadu. You never think of that as a Buddhist place, but there were Buddhist shrines all over, and you can see the ruins of them. Afghanistan, you'd never think of Pakistan and Afghanistan as being Buddhist, but that was the majority. That was the official religion for centuries, right? Now, what ends up happening is that somewhere about the 7th century or so, Buddhism starts to go into decline. It has less market share, to use a kind of modern expression. So there's a kind of internal change going on. My theory is that it's primarily because of two things. One is that, well, you could say three. Partly people were attracted to the tantric practice, which guaranteed enlightenment in one lifetime. And all of that began originally on the Hindu side, especially among Shiva worshippers, Shaivas. Okay, eventually, then it comes into the form of Buddhism practiced here in Nepal and in Tibet and in a few other places, like in Koyasan in Japan and at one time in Bali. So, but the two factors that made a big difference were the rise of the devotional movement, bhakti, and Vedanta philosophy. Shankaracharya comes along in the 700s And he articulates a philosophy that sounds an awful lot like Buddhism, but is different in critical ways. When
Mhm.
he describes, I mean, I don't need to go into a whole philosophy lesson here, but when in his radical non-dualism, much of what he describes, the way he's trying to describe the nature of reality, would lead almost any Buddhist to say, I think he's talking about shunyata. I think he's talking about emptiness here. But what
Mhm.
he did kind of cleverly is that even though he was primarily giving a commentary on the Upanishads, the origins of Indian philosophy, and a few other sources, the Bhagavad Gita among them. But when when he explains the viewpoint that he has, he's always taking a position against what he refers to as the Nastika. Okay, well, na astika is the Sanskrit word for an atheist or a non-believer. Okay, someone who denies an
Mhm.
essential truth, saying it is not. That's what na asti means. Okay, so in a way, I think what he did was provided an alternative to Buddhism that was easier to swallow, so to speak. I mean, if you say the idea of saying
Mhm.
that you come to an awareness that you don't have a soul, that there's no kind of internal substance. Well, people resist that idea. It's like resisting death. It's just as natural to say no. The idea that I have a soul that's definitely going to move on to another life, that's very attractive to me. Um, and so you could say also the certain other aspects of Buddhist teaching then get taken up into the Vedanta tradition, not just by Shankara, but even more importantly by Ramanuja, who comes a couple of centuries later. And Ramanuja now combines Vedanta with bhakti, with devotionalism. Bhakti had a big impact because if you think of it, up until then, when we think of Hindu practices, you're basically talking about Vedic ritual. Vedic ritual is basically something Brahmins do. Now, they do have
Mhm.
patrons who they do it on behalf of, but it isn't something that all the ordinary people take part in. It's something that women don't take part in at all, and except for like the sponsors, the patron's wife has to be present. Brahmin priest must be married, but women have no power, no authority, no agency in that system. Well, when the bhakti comes along, it's related. It's directly related to song and music because it's poetry. It's the praise of Krishna as captured by the poets of South India. So singing, dancing, all this. There's an emotional expression. There's an active, physical way of expressing piety, which is revolutionary. And part of the revolutionary aspect of it is that it didn't matter what caste you are, high caste, low caste, male or female, regional differences made no difference. Everyone is equal in the eyes of God as presented by the Bhakti movement. Okay, so so Vishnu worship, especially Krishna worship, begins to grow as well because of the Bhakti movement, and then along about the 11th century, then we've got Muhammad Khilji and others come in and they wipe out, they destroy monasteries. But it's important to understand that the monasteries were already, kind of crumbling metaphorically. That it wasn't like there was a thriving, 9,000 monks at Nalanda, and then they all got wiped out by the thing. Yeah, it's not how it happened. We know that it was already a decline, and we know that by looking at the records
Yeah.
of the Chinese travelers, because as they come one generation after another, they're when we review their descriptions, we can see that there's a decline.
Right. I remember you emphasizing that Newar Buddhism is not a mix of Buddhism and Hinduism, which, when you look at the temples or some of the rituals and so on, is the first impression. That's what I thought at the beginning. I did, but you emphasize that that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean,
Explain why
here's
that's
what's
not the
going on.
case.
Newar Buddhism is definitely different. It's very non-normative compared to most Buddhism. Some of that is undeniable, and there is some influence from Hinduism. To pretend that there wouldn't be when they live side by side for 2,000 years or more, it'd be pretty strange if there wasn't, mutual impact on each other. But you could say, well, yeah, and my faith as a Christian is very heavily influenced by Judaism. So does that make me a Jew? because when I say Mass, I'm using some prayers that rabbis also recite. Nobody would ever say I'm confused about what religion I'm practicing. Now, what's going on is this. Buddhism thrives in India, right? And it's living alongside Hinduism. So Hinduism and Buddhism growing up together. People will often say, Buddhism grew out of Hinduism. Yeah, in a simplistic way, that's true. So did Jainism, so did Sikhism. But in another way, it's very misleading, because the religion that was practiced at the time that the Buddha lived was hardly Hinduism. It was completely different from what we see today. Shiva and Vishnu, the goddess, they had no role to play. Much of that came from what we think were indigenous religious practices, which, by the way, Bhakti helped to bring into mainstream Hinduism. So you've got Buddhism and Hinduism living alongside each other in India. Then Buddhism disappears, but it doesn't disappear in Nepal. Okay, so people come along and they look at India and say, Hindu temples, Hindu rituals, Hindu ways of doing things, and they come to Nepal and they see something that's South Asian. See, they're making a mistake already. Many things that are being identified as Hindu are really simply shared South Asian culture. It's just that there is no Buddhist example remaining in India. Nowadays, there's a revival of various kinds going on, but traditionally speaking. So it's only here in Katmandú Valley that you see Buddhism and Hinduism living side by side. Specifically, you see Buddhism thriving, but in a larger Hindu framework. By that, I mean the king was a Hindu, and the aristocracy would have been Hindu. The king would rule, by the favor of Lord Pashupatinath, etc. But the two are living side by side. Naturally, they're going to share an awful lot of things. So, so we said it's, you gave the example, say, of a temple, and you say, well, it's the same architects and the same building materials. It's brick and tile and carved wood. Wouldn't it be strange if they weren't similar?
Yeah.
But the fact is, they don't look identical. There are very, very few Buddhist temples that look anything like a Hindu temple. Okay? For starters, because we don't have Buddhist temples. You have monasteries, okay? And so, the word temple gets thrown around in English, like the Golden Temple, in Patan. Well, it's not a temple. It's a Buddhist monastery. And the architecture is very different, as you know from living here. The Buddhist monasteries are all courtyards that face inward. They focus inward. Now, they have a shrine, maybe you can call that a temple, with a main image. And you say, yes, of course, they have statues, just like the Hindus have statues. But Buddhists have statues all over the world. Okay? Of course, in Nepal, when you look at Newar Buddhist art, it's going to look like Newar Hindu art, because the same men, the same artisans are producing both of them. So I could very quickly point out all the differences between a Hindu temple and a Buddhist shrine, okay, or a Buddhist temple or monastery. So, and you say, well, they do the rituals look the same. You say, yeah, they make an offering on a plate. And there's certain things that are universal: flowers, light, incense, some kind of food. But, the Newar Buddhists do a 5-fold offering. The Newar Hindus do a 16-fold offering when they do it. And they don't do it as often as the Newar Buddhists do, where it's part of the daily ritual in the monasteries. So there are actually a lot of differences. But it's kind of like they share a common vocabulary, so to speak, because they share a common origin. Now, to go back to that point I was starting to make about, Vedic religion versus Hindu, the point is that Hinduism and Buddhism grew up side by side. They were never separate. And the model that people have in their heads, even if it's unwitting, when they say, oh, yeah, Buddhism's been heavily influenced by Hinduism, or it's a mixture of the two, they're imagining that this is how you describe two religions meeting. They don't meet. They were never apart. So what I was saying is that it isn't a case of these two religions encountering each other here in the Katmandú Valley. It's what you're looking at is something that was true in all of India for much of history, and that's to say that Hinduism and Buddhism live side by side. Another way to phrase that would be to say that if you could go back to India in, say, the 10th century, you'd probably find that the form of Buddhism that you're seeing being practiced might be much more similar to Katmandú Valley Buddhism than you might imagine. That's to say, the same kind of sense of, oh yeah, the architecture is
Right.
the same, the way of doing things is the same, devotional practices like chanting songs in the vernacular in Sanskrit. Those are all shared elements of religion.
And focusing in particular in the feature of language, Newar Buddhism sometimes is described as the
Mm-hmm.
Sanskrit
Yes,
Vajrayana. So all their texts are in Sanskrit,
correct.
unlike Tibetan Buddhism. But what was the origin of Newar Buddhism
Yes,
is
yeah. I mean,
it
it's,
comes
it's
from
a, one way
Sanskrit.
to describe it. I mean, I just gave a talk in Taiwan a few months ago at a conference, and trying to figure out, do I call it Newar Buddhism? Do I call it Katmandú Valley Buddhism? And there's Sanskrit Buddhism, because that's the key thing. One of the important,
Mhm.
unique things about Newar Buddhism is that it's the only surviving form of Sanskrit Buddhism. That's something that would have been true in all of India. It would have all been
Right.
Sanskrit and, well, Pali. But you would have had
Yeah.
widespread Sanskrit Buddhism. Um, yeah, and it's particularly interesting and unique because the Newars themselves are speaking a Tibeto-Burman language. Newar is closer to Chinese than it is to Sanskrit.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's closer to Chinese than it is to Nepali.
Mm,
The other
interesting.
language they speak. English is closer to Nepali than it is to Newar. So you've got people who are speaking. If you know language, the basic language history theories, you've got people who are speaking a Sino-Tibetan language, Sino-Tibetan, and their daily language, their mother tongue, and yet for religion, they're drawing a language from a completely different language family. Okay, now you might say, well, yeah, okay, and mass was in
Right.
Latin, and if you're I don't know, you could say liturgies are in Arabic and in Greek, and then people don't speak those languages in, let's say, in the United States or in anywhere in the Americas where the religions have spread. But it's a little bit different. Here we're talking about the over the course of 2,000 years, you've got people embracing one language for ritual and philosophical purposes while speaking a very different one. It's also one of the factors that led to the corruption of Newar Sanskrit, which is a serious issue. There are when people one of the critiques of Newar Buddhism is that it's mixed with Hinduism. And you say, really? I said, no, it isn't. No Newar Brahmin thinks he's a Buddhist. And no Vajracharya or Sakya will say, yeah, I'm
Mhm.
basically a Hindu too. They would find it offensive to have that suggestion. They're not confused about their religion. We are, but there is an impact. As
Yeah.
you know, celibacy disappeared somewhere before the end of the first millennium is our best guess. Nepal has had
Mhm.
it's had about 4 or 5 different dynasties over the centuries. Well, we know that in the time of the Lichavis, when many of the Buddhist monasteries here in the valley were founded, at least the original foundations, the buildings are all different now, but that was all during the Lichavi period, which ends in the 7th century. Okay, now at that point, presumably all the
Mhm.
monks are still married. All the evidence we can garner suggests that. By the time the Mullah period begins in the year 1200 or 1201, we've got a gap of 5 centuries. Somewhere in that period, celibacy died out within Newar Buddhism. Okay, so not only were monks allowed to
Mhm.
marry, it became kind of expected. And going further than that, and this is a case of where you say, yes, it is, you could describe it as Hindu influence, monasticism became a caste. You cannot become a monk in Newar Buddhism unless your father and
Mhm.
grandfather and great grandfather, in an unbroken chain, like anywhere in Buddhism, an unbroken chain of ordination, is at work. If there is a rupture, let's say somebody's father doesn't get initiated, then his children traditionally cannot be initiated. His sons cannot be initiated. That is, so this is a major, major change. It's also what I argue is what allowed Buddhism to survive here. If you say, let's go back to the North India example, thinking of places like Nalanda, you say, okay, Islam came in and it destroyed all the monasteries and it basically wiped out Buddhism, what was left of it. Okay, why didn't it wipe out Hinduism? What was the difference? You know, why
Mm.
didn't everybody in India become Muslim?
Mhm.
How did they? How is
Yeah.
it that Hinduism survived and Buddhism didn't? You say, well, here's one reason. When you think of Buddhism, you say, who are the experts in Buddhism? Monks, right? Monks and nuns where they exist. You say, and where do they
Mm.
live? Separated from society. You know, they're renouncers. They leave society and and
Mhm.
live in community together, apart from the ordinary life of the family. Um, Hinduism has renouncers, it has sadhus, but they aren't the teachers. They aren't the people who do the rituals. Those are the practicing Brahmins, the Brahmin priests. The Brahmin priests are all fathers, they're all family men.
Mhm.
And their sons after them will probably take up the same trade, and their sons after them. So, what happened in Nepal was
Right.
that by being one way, for whatever reasons, naturally pulled into or forced into it. Sometimes they say a particular king, Jayastiti Malla, ordered them all to become a caste. I find that a little unlikely, but the point is that at some point they became a caste. Okay? That's why it survives. You say there will
Mhm.
never be a shortage of Newar monks because they're being born every day. Because every boy, every validly
Mhm.
ordained Sakya or Vajracharya, his sons can be ordained after him, usually before the age of 12. So what's happened is that Buddhism has sunk very deep roots into the family here, which it never had in India, and that's why it survives, I think. So it's a big adaptation. It's a big change.
Right.
But so is a lot of what's going on in Buddhism. I mean, think of where I teach, where you studied at Ranjung Yeshe Institute. How many of the students become monks or nuns? The answer is almost none. You know, maybe like less than 1% at this point, far
Yeah.
less than 1%. But uh, the point being that monasticism just isn't that important to like neo-Buddhist or Western Buddhist, however you want to phrase it, and that's partly because the teachers themselves, especially the Tibetans, but even with many of the Theravadan missionaries who've gone to the West, they say, well, we can't bring it all over. You don't have to adapt. You don't have to adopt the culture completely. Now, it depends. There's a big difference when you're talking about,
Mhm.
say, monks coming as chaplains to a migrant community, an immigrant community. Sure, there it's going to look much more
Right.
like the homeland, but otherwise, if you think of it, think of all the centers that have grown up in the Americas, especially in North America, over the last 40 or 50 years. How many of them are monasteries with local monks in them? I don't know of any. Not in the Vajrayana tradition.
Mhm.
Um, in Europe, France has I
Right.
think 2 monasteries now. Uh, I don't know all the facts on these things, but what's very overwhelmingly obvious is that monasticism is not that important. It's much more that meditation practice and
Mhm.
other practices are very important to people. Um, so you say, well, there's a
Mhm.
way in which it's kind of like a lay-led Buddhism. Monks are not central, you know. So it's different from
Mhm.
Nalanda in the 10th century. You say, pointing back to that phenomenon of if the experts in the religion, the scholars, the teachers are all segregated from society, well, it's easy to kind of drop a bomb metaphorically on that one place and wipe out the religion or damage it very
Yeah.
severely. When there's a deeper integration into society, then it's a very different situation. The other comparison is that you have some of the most important Buddhist movements in the world are things like the Tzu Chi movement in Taiwan, or Dharma Drum, Fo Guangshan, etc. Uh, Even Nichiren Buddha, many of the branches of Nichiren, including Soka Gakkai in Japan. These are all forms of Buddhism where it's primarily how should we say it's the laity take the lead, even if there's monastic leadership of some kind.
So, and since you mentioned the caste system, this is a special feature of Newar Buddhism. Could you describe or talk a bit more about? I guess we don't know the specifics about its origin.
Yeah,
How does
one
it
thing to
work
bear in mind is
nowadays?
this: there are two kind of two anecdotes, as it were. One from Father John Locke, who's the first great scholar of Newar Buddhism, and another from David Gellner, who really went into great depth and produced a very fundamental book monk householder and tantric priest. Now, Gellner has a story of being, when he was doing his field work, he was trying to learn about how Vajracharyas, especially since they were the priest, how they viewed the bhikshus, because they're within the Newar community. Theravada Buddhism was brought in by missionaries starting in 1920s actually, but it really picked up steam after Nepal opened to the outside world in the 1950s, and so we have more and more Newars practicing Theravada Buddhism, and the serious practitioners really don't see traditional Newar Buddhism as real Buddhism. They see it as a corrupted form. All right, that's not a universal thing, and it doesn't mean that they fight each other. It just means that they think that all Mahayana is an elaboration that's unjustified. Anyway, so with the Gellner was meeting with these guys, and he kept saying things like, he said, "Well, do you ever call the bhikshus like to your house for a dana? Or like, do you send your kids off to the Dharma Shiksha, the Dharma education classes in the Theravada Viharas, or do you ever go to hear the bhikshus speaking?" He said, one of the guys, you can see he was growing visibly irritated, and finally he said, "Jimihe Bhikshuta." He said, "We are also monks." Like, meaning, stop calling them monks as if they were. For me, the parallel is when somebody says, "Yeah, he's Catholic and I'm Christian," and I said, "No, it isn't." I said, "Sorry, we're all Christian. You're Protestant, I'm Catholic. That's where the divide is." But what he was saying was, you're delegitimizing us. And the point is that they still have this strong, clear sense that they are the Sangha of Newar Buddhism. On the John Locke side, I remember him saying that at one point, he was talking with some Vajracharyas or Sakyas, and they were explaining. They said, "You can call us a caste," which is what he was doing. He'd say, like, does the Sakya caste do this? Does the Vajracharya caste do this? Using jati or tad. And they said, "It's not exactly a jati. We're different." So it's kind of like they've been assimilated into the caste system, and yet in their own understanding, the point was that they say, "Well, but we aren't really a caste, because we're Buddhist, and Buddhists renounce, we're the Sangha, and the Buddhist Sangha renounces the world." Now, for other Buddhists to be in the caste system, the ones who are not Sakya and Vajracharya, that's to say, not the monastic groups, said, that's another case, really, I think, where you say, don't call it Hindu, call it South Asian, because the stratification of society, is something that would be shared. The Buddha did not come along to say, "I've come to get rid of caste," as modern Indians will sometimes say. He didn't come to purify Hinduism or reform it, as you'll often hear. But at least the way I would defend the points I just made. But you say, yes, he did say that being a Brahmin is not important, because doing the ritual sacrifices doesn't really keep the world running. It doesn't create merit that will help your soul, etc. So in one way, he undermines caste, but his purpose is not to eliminate caste. So anyway, but so what we have then is, you've got a system among the Newars, again, like all of South Asia, there's a caste system. The difference is that you end up at the top of the hierarchy, there's a split. I sometimes describe this as a Y model of caste, because you've got Vajracharya and Sakya on one side, the monastic caste, right? And you've got basically Brahmins over on this side, and they're really equivalent. Right? One's not higher than the other. Now, the Brahmins might say, "Well, no, we're higher because the king, blah, blah." But the point is that in society, people say, yes, for Hindus, the Brahmins are paramount. For the Buddhists, the Vajracharya and Sakya are paramount. So now where it gets a little tricky is you say, okay, then below the Vajracharya and Sakya, there's traditionally this large group called the Uray, right? The Uray are people like the Tuladars, who were traditionally traders, Kansakars, who were bronze workers, and a number of other castes. So they see themselves as the kind of devout lay people, the Upasaka of Newar Buddhism. You've got something of a parallel on the other side, not exactly Kshetri, the second great Varna in Hinduism, but you've got Shrestas, legitimate, real Shrestas. So they, who kind of function like to some extent, they see themselves as the Kshetris, the Kshatriya of Newar Buddhism. From that point down, just below that, then would be the farming caste, the Japu, who are a very, very big swath of Newar society. And my argument is that they're the core, that they're the original core. They represent the original core of the Newar people, because of certain hints that we have about how the city is divided up following associations with the Japus, the farmers, or Maharjans, as they call themselves now. So most Maharjans have a Brahmin, or sorry, have a Buddhist priest, at least in Katmandú and in Patan. In Patan, almost universally so. Bhaktapur is a little different. Bhaktapur is a later foundation. It was, even though we now think of it as it's this museum city, it's the old city that you can go view. But it's important to bear in mind that Bhaktapur only grew, toward the end of the Malla period, and it was more self-consciously Hindu, and the kings kind of deliberately, promoted Hinduism there. So the extent of the Sangha is smaller. There are very few viharas compared to Katmandú and Patan. I mean, in Patan you have 200 monasteries, and there are 400 in the whole valley. But in Bhaktapur, it's only a dozen or so, or a few dozen. I forget the number right now. But so, where was I going with that? Yeah. So when you're looking at the caste, you say you've got the Japus, who are basically Buddhist. In fact, very often a particular Japu family will have a link with a particular Vajracharya family, and the farmer caste guy will perform certain ritual services for the Vajracharya. If you see a Newar wedding here, as you know, there's always a procession, the janti, when the men folk from the boys' side all go to the girl's house in order to basically bring her back to his family. Now, the procession is always led, by guys if it's at night, especially with torches. But you used to always see a Maharjan, a farmer, carrying the hanging baskets, where they put a bamboo holding two baskets and a balance, and that would be in all the Vajracharya's ritual equipment was in that. Carrying it, like his kit to do the ceremony when he got to the girl's house. So and those relationships are inherited. You don't just hire somebody and say, "Are you free next Saturday to carry my stuff?" It's because the grandfather of that Japu served the grandfather of the Vajracharya priest. From that point, from the point, say this. The place in the caste system, from the Japu farming caste downward, there is a kind of ambiguity about what religion people are practicing. Okay? In some context, they'll attend both Buddhist and Hindu festivals. Okay, if they go into a shrine, if it's and I'm talking about the lower end of the spectrum here, people might go, they'll get to the stupa and do a full obeisance. And then they go to a Hindu shrine, go to Pashupati, and do the same thing. All right, so you say, because you can do practices one after the other consecutively that are like A, B, A, B, 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 A, right? You can't hold two different philosophies in your head. You can't believe that there is no self and that there is a self, And in fact, there isn't confusion usually at that level. And the way you can usually clarify this is saying, who do you call when it's time for a ritual? Like, who do you call for what we call samskaras? We call them sacraments in the West. All right. So you say, who do you call? Do you call a Brahmin or do you call a Vajracharya? For me, that's enough of an identification. But even then, to say, well, see, the two religions are mixed up. And you say, no, there are some people who are practicing both. If I go to a synagogue, and put on a yarmulke, that doesn't mean that I'm now a Jewish Christian or a Christian Jew. If I go to a Hindu shrine and chant bhajans, it doesn't mean that I'm suddenly practicing a new religion that's a combination of Hinduism and Christianity. So the religions are clearly distinct. The only other thing, something that I did kind of pass over is kind of the identity of the Sakya and Vajracharya. What gives them their status primarily is the fact that they've taken monastic ordination. Okay, now they only do one ordination, unlike in other, more normative Buddhism, where you have novice ordination and then bhikshu ordination later. So, and the ordination usually occurs kind of at novice age. There's some places in Katmandú, I believe, at least in Itum Bahal, and I think it's all throughout the city, a child as young as 6 months, a boy as young as 6 months can be initiated as a monk, which is kind of wild, sort of pulling it away from its mother's breast long enough to initiate it, and give it back. But they usually it's a little bit later than that, but often it's at a young age, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. The ideal usually is that the boy be initiated before the age of 12. Okay. It's very rare. It does happen. I had a friend who, much to his embarrassment, had to go through the ordination when he was 19 years old. And because during the ordination, you have to be completely naked while the monks pour water over you. So he had to call all of his male friends to come and shield him from view. Anyway, but getting back seriously, what they share is this monastic ordination. At that level, Vajracharya and Sakya are the same people. They're exactly the same. In the way you can judge this is that if you go into when you look at Newar monasteries, some have a membership that's entirely Vajracharya. Others have a membership that's entirely Sakya with no Vajracharya. Many of them are mixed between the two. Okay, like Kwabahal, the Golden Temple in Patan, Hiranyavarna Mahavihar, the most famous probably of all the shrines, temples and the Buddhist sites in the valley. There they have a mixture of the two, right? If you go to Ukubahal, the second most important or the second most elaborate, beautiful monastery in Patan, there it's all Sakya. There are no Vajracharyas in the community. So and when they are ordained, or when they're initiated as monks, it's done within a given group. It's according to age, the oldest first down to the youngest, right? So they might be Sakya, Vajracharya, Sakya, Vajracharya, Vajracharya. You see, it has nothing to do with the distinction between Vajracharya and Sakya has nothing to do with monastic ordination. They're all equal. And then their place in the Sangha, their seniority in the Sangha, is strictly by when they were ordained. There isn't a distinction between Vajracharyas. What's different is that Vajracharya boys then later can take a tantric initiation, basically the fivefold abhisheka, the acharya, the making of an acharya. And so this then gives them the obligation to perform certain rituals every day. And ideally, they should be doing certain meditations associated with that. But it also gives them, it gives them the ability to do rituals on behalf of others. Now, in fact, what happens is there are only a certain number of, if you go to Patan, there are probably as many Vajracharyas as there are everybody else. Not everybody can be a priest, is what I'm saying. Just like in the Brahmin community, not every Brahmin is a practicing priest. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any clients. There aren't enough people to go around. So there are certain, within certain families, there are traditions that the man is a practicing Vajracharya, his father before him, his grandfather before him, the great-grandfather before him. And their connection is with the descendants of their clients are also part of an inherent practice, okay? It doesn't mean that they can't take on a new one, but it does mean that they have certain rights. Like they can say, these people are supposed to come to me, and it matters to them because they're living off the stipends, off the dakshina that are being given for the various rituals that they perform. So in one way, you might say, socially speaking, it's a little tricky to say it's happening religiously. There is a kind of higher status to the Vajracharya, so because they're the gurus of the community. In fact, that's how you address them. Nowadays, people almost always say Guruju, or the Newar form of it was Gubaju, which is a shortening of Guru Bhattarakaju or Guru Baju. So anyway,
the Newar Buddhism is such an enclosed system Do foreigners learn from the priest without being part of the community
This
nowadays?
is a
Are they more
very, very
flexible
interesting thing for
or?
me, and it's something I've been eyewitness to over the last 20 years, 20, 30 years since I started directly studying them. The one of the kind of weaknesses, so to speak, of Newar Buddhism is that there's no fresh blood, as it were. You know, if you can say, well, they're self-sufficient, they
Mhm,
have enough practitioners. You know, they don't need outsiders. But the point is, it's a little bit odd that you say there's absolutely no missionary impulse at all. You know, there's no place for any kind of missionizing. That's
mhm,
not true anywhere else in the world. You know, the modern movements that I described, like the
mhm.
non-monastic
Yeah.
Buddhism, those are all very much proselytizing, missionizing groups. The Tibetans, look, how many converts, the lamas and rinpoches have. The Theravada, same thing. They've kind of lost steam in the last few centuries. In fact, we had a conference about this about 10 years ago about Theravada mission in the 21st century, but the undertone to it was, why is it that the bhikshus are no longer sort of heading out into the world to evangelize or, sorry, missionize other areas. Newars are the only ones who just absolutely don't do any kind of missionizing. I suppose you could say Zen Buddhist also, but that's, I don't know, maybe not an important comparison. But
Yeah.
the when I was doing my field work, it was very clear that there were very strong firewalls that I couldn't pass through. Um, the People would
Mhm,
be reluctant even to talk about certain rituals or even certain locations or images. Like, let's say, all right, so your tantric shrine is up in that corner, and be like, yeah, like they really is like they were reluctant to, it's like, am I breaking a rule by telling him that? He's an outsider. And say, what's the image in there? And they'd be, I know it's Chakra Samvara, but I would get people to say, well, we're not allowed to talk about that. Now, what I was studying is, was daily
Yeah.
ritual, which is very open. It's publicly performed in the shrines or in front of the shrines of all these Newar Buddhist monasteries. But when I went to Bhaktapur, where there are fewer Buddhists, and so they're a little more insular group, there were people who would not let me into the monastery to watch the ritual. Like, I would show up in the morning. What I would do is normally go
Mm,
in an afternoon, make sure that I meet somebody who's an important man in the community, probably a Vajracharya or Sakya, who's likely to be attending the service, and say, here's what I'm doing. I'm writing a book about, this. Um, I'm going to come by tomorrow morning if that's
mhm,
okay. And they'd be like, yeah, sure. Yeah. Get here by 6, which I knew meant get there by 3. Otherwise you'd miss everything.
mhm.
But there were places where, they just said no, and now part of that was because they'd suffered very serious art theft, religious image theft, not art. It was,
Mhm.
it is there
Right.
is a place called Johor Baihi. If you do a tour of Bhaktapur, it's a Baihi that's been totally restored. Okay, and it's very, very pretty. Now,
Mhm.
all Newar monasteries have these processional masks, like much larger than human size, of Dipankara Buddha, the original Buddha, so to speak, the Adi Buddha,
Mhm.
and it's just made up of the mask and then the hands, usually in a fear not gesture and a gift giving, the boon granting gesture. So the Jorbahi mask was stolen I think a few weeks or maybe a few months before I showed up. And well, there were people who
Oh,
Jorbahi people didn't want me coming anywhere near because they said, oh, it's all the Westerners who are causing this problem, or outsiders are causing this problem, which is ultimately true. If there
mm,
weren't an art market out
right.
there, then nobody would be stealing their images. But it also conveniently
Mhm.
leaves out that it's probably a member of their monastery who helped to liberate the image, and get it sold to the West, or somebody in the local community. Um, so anyway, yeah. But
Yeah.
so there were people who would like pull the curtains when I came to see the ritual, and say, no, no, you can't see this, which
Right.
was, it kind of showed an ignorance on their part, because there's nothing esoteric about about the daily ritual. It's Buddha puja
Mhm.
that's performed all over the Buddhist world.
Mhm.
So, but this would be kind of
Mhm.
evidence of a little bit of evidence of the corruption of Newar Buddhism. I think perhaps when you were in Katmandú, if you
Mhm.
visited the Golden Temple, as we call it, Kwa Bahal, there used to always be a sign, no photographs allowed. Sometimes people would say, it's weird, it's
Mhm.
Buddhism. Why? It's
Mhm.
not like it's some tantric, it's like some, deity
Yeah.
sizzling with power that's going to, is it, and cameras only came here in, about 60 years ago. So how did they decide that photographs aren't allowed? So to us, it would be like very odd that they wouldn't allow the photographs as, being Buddhist, because they don't have the same purity restrictions and all this that the Hindus do. And eventually that caught up, so that then younger Newar started saying, yeah, why don't we allow photography? I went to Japan and we take pictures of all the temples there. Nobody
Mhm.
ever stops us, and we can go to Tibet. People,
Yeah.
why is it that Newar aren't allowed to take pictures of a statue? And they took down the sign. You can now go and freely take pictures. The cover of the book that I wrote on
Oh.
ritual has a picture of two boys standing in the door frame of that shrine. Okay? And the reason they're standing there is to block the image behind, so that I don't accidentally or cleverly get a picture of the image. Now I could put the image
Mhm.
itself on the cover of the book. So that's a big change. But what's even more
Right.
interesting is that a number of people have gone on and done more Newar studies. Austin Simoes Gomes is doing a PhD at the University of Toronto. We've had people like Anahi Tisige, Mundal Jahan, others doing more work. And in particular, they became interested in, at least the women, the Dutch woman and the Bangladeshi woman, are both interested in ritual dance, all right, and performance. Um,
Mm.
in order to take the training, they had to go through an initiation, a deka, as they call it, which is a corruption of diksha, what Tibetans would call a wong. Now, in the
Mhm.
Tibetan world, it's pretty wide
Mhm.
open. And every once in a while they'll close the door and say, "Yeah, the
Yeah.
wong's going on," but everybody can still look through the window and watch, Rinpoche initiating people. And very often it's just wide open. If I got, well, maybe not me because they know who I am, but
Right.
if somebody just wandered in and said, "Yeah, I want to take this empowerment, and then I'm going to sit through the teachings," they would be given the empowerment. For Newars, that's like unbelievably,
Right.
that they can't imagine how that could ever happen. Now, but what to round this out? So 30 years ago, I wasn't allowed to even look into some non-esoteric shrines. All right, I would never be allowed to look into
Mhm.
a shrine where any kind of tantric practice is taking place. Now we have people who've been initiated, and in order to enter into the shrine, and they've been, or to be given the teaching of ritual dance, what's called charya, okay, the charya nitya. So so this
Right.
is, for me, this is mind blowing. The change. It's a very, very significant one. But again, it's
Mhm.
it's part of the.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a direct result ultimately of the fact that Nepal opened to the outside world. You know, so being closed probably helped
Mhm.
preserve Buddhism.
Mhm.
You know, particularly because
Yeah.
after the
Yeah.
Gorkhalis, I mean, the Mullah kings were, they supported both Buddhism and Hinduism. I have a pet theory that a lot of the Mullah kings were probably really Buddhist at heart, just like in Thailand. Who's the king?
Mhm.
Rama. Rama the
Mhm.
Ninth, Rama the Tenth. Guess what? That's a Hindu name. When there's all
Mhm.
this Hindu paraphernalia, Hindu titles, and when the last king, when King Bhumibol was cremated, it was a Hindu ceremony. It was done by Brahmins, and there are Brahmins who do a fire sacrifice, at the palace every morning or on, certain appointed days. The but the king's obviously a Buddhist. It's Thailand. So I think that was probably true of a lot of the
Mhm.
Newar kings.
Right.
When you look at, at least during Lichavi times, when you look at
Yeah.
Ukubahal, where I did most of my research, it's the full name of it is Shiva Deva Sanskarita Sri Rudravarna blah blah. Shiva Deva was a king, eh, who handed over the kingdom, the crown, to
Mhm.
his son, and then became a monk. Okay, goes from being, the incarnation of
Right.
Vishnu to being a Buddhist monk. So that suggests that there was a pretty broad, widespread
Right.
practice of Buddhism. So
To,
that's an
to address
example of where I
this
think you
issue.
can say very clearly that there's a big difference between Tibetan Buddhism and Newar Buddhism. Normally I take the approach of pointing out that nobody would consider nowadays nobody would consider Tibetan Buddhism to be not Buddhism, or mixed up with another religion. It's the kind of,
Mhm.
for most, especially for outsiders and for practitioners, obviously, it's the premier form
Yeah.
of Buddhism. All right, so and I usually go
Mhm.
to great lengths to say, look, they're doing basically the same rituals, they're doing the same empowerments, they're using the same text. In this case, you really do have to say there's something different. Because what saved Newar Buddhism was a
Mhm.
kind of turning inward, right? And that's what helped to preserve it.
Mhm.
Turning
Mhm.
inward, but within society, with these deep roots in the family structure. All right. It became, as you know, that it's not just that monasticism became a caste, but in another way, it's even more restricted than that. When a boy is initiated as a Sakya
Mhm.
Vajracharya, say in Uku Bahal, he's really only a Sakyan Vajracharya for Uku Bahal. He only has rights in that monastery. He only has obligations in that.
Mhm.
And there are very,
Right.
very few situations where you kind of move beyond your immediate Sangha into the larger community. Obviously, as a caste, they're very aware of, they have a widespread kind of connectedness. When marriages come along, they're going to be looking for somebody from a different monastery, a different city, even, So, but the point is that it otherwise it's very, very, very tightly restricted to, even the monastery that you were initiated in. If there's like, for example, if you're from the lineage of the Golden Temple, Kwabahal, you cannot be initiated in any other place. Your children cannot be initiated. Sons cannot be initiated anywhere else. This is what led to many Sakya and Vajracharya not getting initiated. There was a break in the tradition because their fathers were busy in Tibet, as
Right.
traders, and they weren't able to arrange things down
Mhm.
here. They'd gone off to West Nepal to be traders, artisans, and they couldn't get
Right.
back to Katmandú on the very few particular auspicious days. In fact, how would they even know what the auspicious days were? Because
Mhm.
it's the head Brahm, like the head of the monastery back in Katmandu, who's saying, right, we've done the calculation. Here are the 3 days coming up when you can do an initiation. How would someone in Pokhara know that before there was communications, before there were any roads,
Mhm.
So there were people who went out of the valley for trade or to practice a craft like statue making or whatever, jewelry making. They very often effectively lost all contact with the Sangha back home. So because of that, you have this kind of insularity to Newar Buddhism where it really doesn't have an impact beyond tourists, coming, or other Nepalis coming and looking at it. They might appreciate it. They might say, wow, it's the impetus that gave rise to most of the beautiful art, in Kabandu Valley, and that's considerable. But it's very, very different from Tibetan Buddhism in that as I said, there's no missionary impulse in it at all.
Right. And it's very interesting the way that nowadays Tibetan Buddhism spread in the West, where you have a Rinpoche going, giving an empowerment, and then maybe not visiting again for 1 year or 2 years. Whereas in New Wari Buddhism, you have this sense of community, which
Yeah.
is very important to find, purpose, meaning in
Mhm.
life, and eventually happiness, which
Yeah.
is lacking in other forms of
Yeah.
Buddhism,
The
especially
other
in
thing too
modern
is
days.
how do you say, something that's always interesting to look at is the pastoral role, and to what extent the pastoral role has, and this is true of any religion, the I mean, as you know,
Hmm.
coming from the background you do, a Catholic priest has different obligations than a Protestant minister. I mean, there's in some ways much more that you're expected to do. You're certainly expected to be available more than a married man with a family, etc.
Hmm.
And so those factors shape it. You look at, say, Judaism and say, is the rabbi a teacher only, or is he also a counselor? Well, I mean, probably in modern
Mhm.
times, you could say most rabbis also fulfill a counseling role. But usually the counseling was about how to be a better practitioner. It wasn't really about, necessarily about how to deal with
Mhm.
depression or how to deal with grief. So that might not be the best
Right.
example because rabbis do a lot of that. But that's my point is that you can't, it's not an equivocal thing that you say a molana and a rabbi and a priest and a minister and a bhikshu, all perform these services for their community. There is a little bit of the kind of pastoral side. It's there is this practice. It's not, you say it's not terribly widespread. It's not because most Newar Buddhists don't take part in it, but the Ashtami Vrata, which is the Newar version. It's done on the eighth day of the bright half of the month, and and it's basically this overnight ritual that's performed where people fast and then they do the puja in
Mhm.
the morning, but they're listening to the Vajracharya preaching. Eh? So there they really are, so they're
Mhm.
doing a real job of kind of making the Dharma available in a way that helps people, that makes sense to them in their everyday life. You may recall too that there's something interesting. It's more symbolic than it is practical, but there's a wonderful thing that happens at Newar weddings, at least Buddhist ones, where as the bridal party, the boys have come to the girl's house. They're now ready to take the young woman back to the boy's family, which that now becomes her family officially. And they, at a certain point, at least in Patan, usually a young boy runs ahead and puts a sukunda down in the middle of the road. The sukunda is the oil lamp that's basically like a jug of oil with a little lamp on the side of it. It's a very clever thing because you can keep refilling the lamp, all day long, all night long.
Mhm.
So, but on it is always an image of Ganesh, eh? And so sometimes the Buddhist version is
Mhm.
slightly different. But the point is that they're seen as a witness. You never lie in front of an image of Ganesh. Very dangerous. So the boy runs ahead, puts it down, and then what happens is the two Vajracharyas, the boys and the girls, then go into a dialogue that's called the dialogue of love, the bichakon. But it's very stereotyped, very ritualized, but it's also there's a personal element to it too. They improvise basically. And they say, well, the girls
Yeah.
priest will say, please be gentle with her. She just stopped playing with dolls recently, and she doesn't know anything yet, and her mother-in-law is going to have to teach her everything, etc. But she's a good girl. And then the boys priest will respond and say, no, this is a good
Mhm.
family. You have nothing to worry about. They're very respectable people, and the boy is also a nice young man who's only recently, blah blah blah. And the ones who do it better, like there's a man in Patan called Bhairatna Vajracharya at Hiranyavarna Mahavihar. He was brilliant at it, and people would love it. It seemed like listening and listening, like leaning in, like what's he saying. And yeah, so there is
Mhm.
that, there are elements, but I mean that's that's very different from like the input that you're getting from a daily sermon or a weekly sermon in a church or something or in a
Mhm.
synagogue. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And the last question, Father Greg, since you have studied so deeply Christianity and different variants of Buddhism, do you see a way in which they complement each other? Maybe from a spiritual but also cultural place, or that has enriched
Well, I
your
would say
spiritual path?
this is the way it kind of shakes down for me. I say you don't. Truth is truth. Okay. It isn't like they're. I mean, I'm. Obviously, I'm an anthropologist. I study culture. I know. I can understand how you say things are culturally conditioned. But the point is that still, ultimately, we
Mhm.
say is something true or not true. Okay. So if you encounter something and you say, well, it's true, but it's not part of my traditional belief system, therefore it's irrelevant. And say, well, isn't all religion supposed to be somehow about a search for truth? Seeing things as they really are, taking away
Mhm.
that either the ignorance or the sin that blocks you from seeing, the way things are. So um, I say to some extent, well, there are many aspects of Buddhism that just to me seem like naturally, fit with Christianity. Okay? Um, I mean, it's not an
Ujú,
arrogant thing to say that I know more about Buddhism than most Buddhists, if you think about it, just because you do too, because you study it,
ya,
and so you know much more than the average layperson. So there are many elements of it that I see that I say, that really fits. Like I had to write an article for a publication that the Jesuits will release next year, and it was about praying for peace. Okay, and basically I was tackling the question of why do you make a prayer of petition? Do you convince God to change His mind? And then
ujú,
I was using a comparative example by saying, what's going on
ujú,
when Buddhists offer an aspiration? So how does an aspiration differ from a prayer? But then the thing that I would love to have gone into, but
ya,
I wasn't given enough words, was that I thought of what comes out of the Karma Kagyu tradition that John McCransky has taken, where he talks about the benefactors and envisioning, meditating on all those who come before
ujú,
you, and then sort of channeling compassion to yourself and then through yourself to the world. And it fits very well with the real understanding what communion of the saints means. The communio sanctorum in Catholicism and in
ujú,
Anglicanism and others. The the idea that somehow there's a connectedness, and that that good intentions, that
ujú.
positive thoughts and prayers, etc., somehow better. That it's not an illusion to say that it makes the world better. That there is some kind of effect of merit. In the world. So, and you look
Ya,
at if you go through like the Four Noble Truths, and you say life is characterized by unsatisfactoriness. Yes, obviously, the Buddha says get detached, and Jesus
ujú,
says consider the lilies of the field. Don't worry about tomorrow, and worry about what's important. So there are a lot of parallels.
ujú,
But you say, all right, so suffering, and the suffering is caused by attachment. All right, and if you can become detached, well, then you're going to become happier. There's nothing about that that doesn't line up perfectly with Christianity. With genuine Christianity. The
ujú,
Yeah, and the
ya,
fact that there's hope. The third noble truth. It is possible to escape the suffering. Now, when you get to the fourth noble truth, now we're getting into a different issue, because the Eightfold Path doesn't quite fit
ya,
with the
ujú,
cosmology of Christianity. So, nor does
ujú,
reincarnation of any kind. But but there's so much that fits very well with Christian spirituality. I mean, look at what's the vow of poverty about? It's supposed to be, a witness to the idea that saying being attached to material things does you no good. To really make spiritual progress, you have to be free from,
ujú,
even if you have to possess things, you can still be detached from them. The attitude of upeksha, in
ya,
all your relationships, where you're neither, where there can be warmth and love, and you're not going to fall to pieces because somebody dies. It's not going to end your life psychologically. So
ujú,
there are many examples actually. When I sometimes I just make that the subject of my meditation, like saying, you know this how does this fit with what I believe as a when I see something that resonates with me in Buddhism, then I'll say, okay, how does this fit with what I believe as a Christian? And that makes a difference. And I then
ujú,
start looking at things differently.
ujú.
Yeah. So,
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a good note to complete the interview. Thank you very much for
okay.
taking time out of your busy schedule. And hopefully we
Okay.
can grab a chai
Great.
in
Okay.
Nepal
Hope to see
at
you
the end of the
soon.
year.
Take care then. Bye bye.
Yeah.
Tashigale.
Thank you very much. Gracias por quedarte hasta el final del episodio. Si te gusta el contenido relacionado con el budismo, te sugiero que te suscribas en buscandocerteza.com a la lista de correo y la próxima vez que esté publicando un ensayo, una traducción o un episodio del podcast, te voy a estar notificando por email. Ahora sí, hasta la próxima.